Good evening. It's Tuesday, January 3rd, 2023. Welcome to a new episode of System Update, our new live nightly show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively here on Rumble, the free speech alternative to YouTube. Tonight, we examine the latest drama in the Capitol, Kevin McCarthy's ongoing inability to get the 218 votes he needs to be Speaker, and what it reveals about both political parties and our politics in Washington generally. Then, for our interview segment, we will speak to one of the most independent-minded, insightful, hilarious, and successful independent political commentators on the internet, Jimmy Dore, who has built a large and loyal audience by relentlessly critiquing the establishment wings of both parties, the U.S. national security state, and the swamp that continues to preside over all of it. As always, as soon as we're done with our 1 hour live show here on Rumble, we will move to locals for our interactive after show to take your questions and comment on your feedback. To obtain access to our after show, simply sign up as a member to our locals community. The red button is on the upper right-hand page of the Rumble page. For now, welcome to a new episode of System Update, starting right now. On this show, and in my journalism generally, we rarely talk about politics through the prism of the two political parties. That's true for so many reasons, starting with the fact that the establishment wings of each party have so much more in common than they do differences, that anyone who sees the world through a primarily partisan lens is destined to wander very far astray very quickly from the dynamics and insights that truly matter. That's the cable news way of seeing the world, for a good reason. It's far more obfuscating than illuminating. The Democrat versus Republican theater is designed to hide and distract your attention away from the real power dynamics in Washington, where both parties are generally on board. But on last night's show, we decided to make an exception. That's because there is one difference between the parties right now worth acknowledging. Democrats, from their so-called right-wing and centrist to their so-called left-wing and everything in between, have become extremely adept at marching in lockstep, following the decrees of their party leaders, liberating themselves of any internal dissent, and uniting as one hive-minded herd of like-minded consensus. Most of this was due to the emergence of Trump. If you really believe that you're now in a historic battle to vanquish the new Hitler and his Nazi party, I suppose it makes a kind of sense that you would reject any attempts to argue amongst yourselves or defy orders from the army you imagine yourself part of. Though I also think it has much to do with the modern-day left-liberal mentality in the U.S. It has become an authoritarian movement in terms of what it believes and supports. A union of state and corporate power to censor the internet, a belief that the CIA, FBI, and Homeland Security are benevolent institutions, an eager to use American political power to interfere in multiple countries around the world based on the neocon fairy tale that the U.S. foreign policy community seeks to spread democracy and human rights and vanquish tyranny. And authoritarianism at its core disdains disorder and defiance, and venerates instead subservience to one's leaders. So although they love to think of themselves in the exact opposite vein, as sophisticates who are far too intelligent and intellectual and educated and individualistic to be led like some cult, that's exactly what they have become. Democratic politicians, including those who branded themselves anti-establishment left-wing radicals and dissidents, not only do what they're told with remarkably unyielding obedience, but they seem to take pride in this fact, as if it's an accomplishment to be celebrated. They're proud of their subservience and of their relinquishment and submission of any individual thoughts at the altar of the will of their leaders. The Democratic Party is a well-oiled machine whose primary characteristic is that its members think exactly alike and do what and think what they're told. By contrast, as we're seeing today, yet again, Republicans and conservatives are constantly arguing with one another, debating and fighting over, sometimes bitterly, not ancillary ideological differences, but fundamental ones. Their standard bearer in the last two presidential elections, Donald Trump, after all, became their nominee by vehemently denouncing the establishment wings of both parties, but especially his own. And he and his movement, at least in rhetoric and professed beliefs, became profoundly hostile to the long-standing orthodoxies of their party on both foreign and economic policy. When Trump vowed to drain the swamp, he didn't just mean Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, but he also meant Mitch McConnell, the hordes of neocons, long-running Republican foreign policy, the Bushes and the Cheneys, the U.S. security state itself. And they knew that those institutions did, which is why they became so strongly opposed to Trump and so determined to subvert his campaign and then his presidency. So given that theme of last night's show, we owe real thanks to House Democrats and, for that matter, to House Republicans for so vividly illustrating that core truth of this perspective we advanced last night. As we suggested, House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy failed today on 3 separate ballots to get the 218 votes needed to become House Speaker. Between the 5 or 6 anti-establishment populists in his caucus who seemed determined never to vote for him no matter what, led by Florida's Matt Gaetz, and a group of roughly 10 others who are still attempting to extract concessions in exchange for their support, you see the names of the holdouts on the screen, McCarthy's path to the speakership, though I'd rate it, I guess, is still likely, is genuinely imperiled and definitely far from certain. On the 3rd vote today, he only received 202 of the 218 votes needed, with the other 16 going to Ohio's Jim Jordan, who himself is supporting McCarthy. Again, there you see the holdouts of the names of the holdouts. Now, whatever you think of their incentives and arguments, what these holdout Republican House members are doing is called politics. Politics is the art of determining what power and leverage you wield, and then using it to advance the policy agenda and your own personal positioning that you believe will produce positive outcomes. Rather than obediently falling into line and marching behind the decrees of party leaders, which strips you of all your power, these dissident Republican members, for better or worse, are instead following their own will and their own conscience, and in many cases, the clearly expressed wishes of their voters, imagine that, who want not another establishment crony like Kevin McCarthy in charge of the House, but more revolutionary, swamp-draining change. Now, other House Republicans who are clearly populist, such as Marjorie Taylor Greene, already became yes votes for McCarthy because, in her view, I think quite validly, no matter who the Republicans choose ultimately settle on as Speaker, won't really be that much different or better than McCarthy, including Jim Jordan. And that's really not worth fighting over in her view, especially since McCarthy gave Greene what she really wanted. The recognition that as one of the most trusted and respected representatives of MAGA and anti-establishment right-wing populist voters, she deserves the committee assignment she wants, particularly those that would empower her to lead probing and aggressive investigations that so far have been hidden or ignored by the Democratic Party and their corporate media allies. So her argument is, let's get on with that, the stuff that actually matters. So, though some end up in different places, most of these House Republicans are not obeying party dictates, but are doing the opposite, defying party leadership to stay true to the values their voters sent them to Washington to defend. But amazingly, when House Democrats look at all of this, they do not see an impressive display of independence or of will or defiance of party leadership. What they see, seemingly all of them, including the vaunted squad who got elected by promising to aggressively challenge and subvert Democratic Party leadership, what they look at and see is an embarrassing mess, some disorderly refusal to submit to authority, and a kind of distasteful and gauche failure to snap into line and march in lockstep behind party bosses as they so willingly and successfully do. House Democrats spent the day today openly mocking Republicans for what they apparently regard as their shameful internal divisions. One of the most embarrassing displays came, unsurprisingly, from New York Democrat and squad member Jamal Bowman. On his Twitter feed, he posed self-consciously with other members of the far more orderly and obedient Democratic caucus as they all sat and grinned in apparent pride over how they, unlike these conservative ruffians, did what they were told to do without making any fuss when choosing their leader. Bowman proudly exclaimed, quote, "Kevin McCarthy doesn't have the votes. We're in a good mood." Why? At some point, the House Republicans will use their slim majority to elect a Republican, not a Democrat, who ends up as Speaker. Do Americans really care? Will they even remember by next week, if they take note at all, that it took a few ballots or a couple days for the House Republicans to decide on a Speaker? The reason Bowman is grinning with such pride seems very obvious at this point. Like all authoritarians, he and his Democratic colleagues venerate order and subservience to leaders as the highest value. To him, watching a couple of dozen Congress members wrangle for power and leverage is a source of shame, because it is the result of what he regards as an irreverent and insubordinate refusal to snap into line on command, an attribute he evidently regards as noble. And the reason I know that he thinks this way isn't just because of this clean grin he donned today. It's because the politics of himself and his fellow squad members, which they practice, is driven by little other than subservience to party leaders and obsequiously falling into line behind those leaders, even when doing so is a complete negation of everything they claim to believe in. Maybe you missed it because it happened so quickly, but House Democrats 2 weeks ago chose their own leader. Not only was there nothing contentious about it, there was no debate about it, no dissent or competition of any kind. They didn't even need a roll call vote. It was unanimous by acclamation. And the person they chose to be their leader, Hakeem Jeffries, is the living and breathing embodiment of everything the squad got elected claiming to oppose and despise and determined to fight against. Now, as we documented on one of the pre-launch shows we aired here on Rumble before our debut, this new House Democratic leader, Hakeem Jeffries, is the pure essence of K Street lobbyist politics. He is the ultimate guardian of the status quo and the DC swamp power structure. The primary talent Jeffries has displayed that has enabled him to rise into the ranks of the senior level of Democratic Party leadership is an ability to raise vast sums of money from Wall Street and serve and protect the interests of every corporate donor and lobbyist he can find. And beyond all of that, Jeffries not only hates the left-wing faction that AOC, Bowman, and the rest of the squad claim to represent, he is open about his hatred for them. He revels in it. He raised money for and endorsed every Democratic incumbent challenged by these squad insurgents, and then worked to defeat each of them. He reviles them and their politics. And he apparently derives more joy from expressing his contempt of the squad than anyone I know other than our next guest, Jimmy Dore. That's why in 2018, AOC made no secret of her intent to support a primary challenger to defeat Hakeem Jeffries, back when people still regarded her radical costume as credible, before she replaced it with the more glamorous one she wore for the Met Gala. AOC's closest aides told Politico that defeating Jeffries is, quote, her highest priority, and that she plans, quote, to take him down. She's going to take Hakeem Jeffries down. The reason? AOC and her allies, quote, feel Jeffries takes too much money from corporate interest, a key litmus test, and is overly friendly with banking and pro-charter school interests. All of which is true, always has been true, and still is true. And that's what made it such a humiliation to see the squad just 4 years later stand meekly by and support this very same Hakeem Jeffries to be their leader. Now, as we documented on that pre-launch show we did, AOC and Bowman and the squad used the cheapest and crudest form of identity politics to justify this humiliating episode. Quote, he's the first ever black party leader. That was the mantra repeated over and over and over, as if that made Jeffries some sort of revolutionary and edgy challenge to Washington power centers instead of what he is, the ultimate loyal servant to its interests. But that, as AOC herself used to argue before being elected to Congress, is the purpose of these crude versions of identity politics. To glorify banal, sleazy, corrupt politicians like Hakeem Jeffries as some sort of courageous blow to the system. One of Jeffries' closest allies in the Congress was the longtime Democratic incumbent against whom Jamal Bowman ran and defeated, Eliot Engel. Jeffries did everything he could to orchestrate Jamal Bowman's defeat. And even once the squad became very loyal Democratic incumbents, Jeffrey hated them so much that he still used his senior position in the House and his vast fundraising prowess to try to sabotage and defeat the squad. And what did the squad do in response to Jeffrey's aggressive acts against them? Like Stockholm Syndrome hostages who fall deeply and masochistically in love with their captives, they became some of his biggest and most obsequious boosters. Not only did Bowman support Jeffries to be his party leader, but he unleashed one of the most cringe-inducing lines ever to glorify Hakeem Jeffries' ascension. When asked about the likely fact that both the Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer and the new House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries would both be from New York City, hardly a surprise given its proximity to Wall Street and all their top money donors, Bauman replied, "That's pretty gangster." Pretty gangster. Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries. After I tweeted my reaction, after seeing that grinning photo of Bowman, quote, I said, "These GOP holdouts are doing what the squad never has the courage to do. They're using their power to defy party leadership in order to extract concessions. Not sure why it's a source of pride to show how you always submit to party orders like good little soldiers. Not much dignity in that, is there?" In response to that, the Washington Post columnist Jason Willick reacted to my tweet with this observation, quote, "I think this is the only real takeaway from today's drama. As Pelosi's rules showed, Democratic disruptors, are scare quotes, are still firmly under their party's control. As Trump's tenure showed, the GOP landscape is much wilder. Indeed it is." So I hope Democrats have fun today as they watch actual politicians across the aisle do what real politicians do and ought to do, use one of the very few times they have real leverage to extract concessions in defiance of party leaders in order to get what they want, rather than fall meekly and obediently into line behind them and do what they're told without a peep of protest or dissent. The examples of the squad completely abandoning their own professed values in order to advance the only thing they really seem to believe in, servitude to partisan commands, is far too long to list tonight, especially when we have such an esteemed and important guest waiting for us to talk to. We don't want to keep him waiting. We've covered these episodes all before in depth, many times, as unpleasant and cringe-inducing as that work is. Watching these gruesome, borderline pornographic scenes of submission by the squad to Nancy Pelosi and the Biden White House is a sacrifice we make for the journalism. The journalism always must come first. So the disorder and fleeting internal divisions in the House Republican caucus over the speaker fight may be disruptive, but given the nature of Washington politics, I far prefer disruption to the meek obedience and orderly submission often by Democratic House members, including, especially, the self-branded anti-establishment radical members of the squad. So for our interview segment tonight, we speak to one of the most heterodox, unpredictable, insightful and independent-minded political commentators in American politics, James Dore. You likely know him as Jimmy, but I'm trying to clean him up a little bit, bestow him with some gravitas to get him ready for his debut appearance in the big time on my show here. Mr. James Dore's trajectory is fairly remarkable. Not all that long ago, he was working for one of the most hackish Democratic Party partisan sites on the entire internet, the Young Turks, hosted by, and I know this isn't polite to say, but sometimes it's just so accurate that it becomes unavoidable to point it out if you want to explain the truth, hosted by two of the genuinely dumbest people in all of American media, Cenk Uygur and Ana Kasparian. And again, when I say dumb, I really don't mean to I don't really say that to be insulting. Many dumb people are really nice. Those two aren't, but many are. By dumb, I just mean that they are only capable of functioning on the most primitive cognitive levels. Simpletons, capable of only the densest and cliched ways of understanding the world, which is what leads someone to see the world as predominantly in cartoon form, as an overarching battle between Democrats, the good guys, and Republicans, the bad guys. But James Dore, being neither partisan nor dumb, was never long for that show, and so he became the ultimate independent journalist. Working only with his wife, he set up a camera in his garage and began speaking very honestly and thoughtfully and passionately and independently about politics, becoming an ardent critic of establishment leaders of both parties, and with nothing more than that, he quickly developed one of the largest, most loyal, and most ideologically diverse audiences on YouTube as host of The Jimmy Dore Show. Since we debuted our show here, I've been really excited for his first appearance on System Update, but for reasons we're about to discuss, the speakership drama in the House today makes today the best possible opportunity to speak to him, which we're going to do right now. Hello, James. It's so great to see you. I'm very happy to see you in this box here on System Update.
It's great to see you, too. I like to talk to you when you're standing. You have a little bit more energy, and the crowd seems to stay awake longer.
Yeah, well, unlike in your show where you put the guests in a tiny little box at the corner so that you can feel big and strong like the Wizard of Oz, we actually put you face level, basically the same size as I am. We don't have to play those games that you play on your show to feel important, but we like it to be an even discussion. So let's begin. When I was getting ready to think about introducing you and how I was going to do that, that phrase that you often use to describe yourself, pothead comedian in your garage, kept popping into my mind. And of course, that is literally true. You are indeed a pothead comedian who does your show from your garage. But you've obviously become much more than that. I think even you're willing to acknowledge that. So I'm wondering, beyond that phrase, how is it that you've come to see your role in the American political and media ecosystem?
It's amazing how bad the corporate news media has become, especially since 1996 when Bill Clinton passed the Telecommunications Act, which took us from 50 giant news media organizations down to just 6. And so now that's why there's no diversity of opinion, and that's why things like Russiagate can happen and everybody thinks it's real. And so my job is to point out where the establishment is lying from the left. And more importantly, I focus on the Democratic Party's unbelievable hypocrisy, and we're living with a uniparty right now. I mean, the whole idea behind the squad was that we would elect those people to go and be a violent opposition to the establishment Democrats, and they would actually take over the party, and they won't do anything. So my job is to let people know that they're being conned by the establishment. You know, this last election, they were trying to tell people that you have to vote for democracy because one party's for democracy, and then as soon as they voted them in, they committed fascism and squashed the strike and took away the right to organize by the railroad workers, which the railroad is the glue that holds our whole economy together. That's how broken down our system is right now. And so my job is to point that out, that if you think you're voting for somebody who represents you, you're not. And I'm there to remind people that the squad and anybody in the Democratic Party is not your friend. They're actually their enemy, even though they know all the words, right? Just like Thomas Frank pointed out in Listen Liberal, they know all the words about democracy. They know all the words of progressivism. They pay fealty to it, but they just go out and rob and steal and lie right out in the open, and nobody cares. So that's my job. My job is to remind people that it's not left or right. It's us against them now. And that obviously, Glenn, not to be hyperbolic, but that is this message that scares them, is that when the people on the left and the right understand that they have a common enemy and that we have actually more in common than the oligarchy wants us to realize, that's what actually threatens them, which is why they have these cultural battles on such high octane right now. And you were talking about identity politics. What I say at my show is to explain what identity politics is. If it was 1860, the Democrats wouldn't be fixing slavery. They'd be bragging about their first transgendered slave owner. And that's the problem. That's where we are. Everybody's distracted while we get crushed economically. They just did a controlled demolition of our economy during COVID, which crushed everybody except a handful of millionaires and billionaires that actually got wealthy. And they want me to hate my neighbor because of the pain I felt during that lockdown, because my neighbor wouldn't take a vaccine that didn't work the way they said it did in the first place. Well, I'm not going to hate my neighbor. I'm going to love my neighbor. I'm going to join with him in our common interests against the establishment. And I'll stop now.
Yeah, no, that is absolutely the thing they fear most, precisely because keeping us divided and hating each other over what are often distracting issues or trivial issues is the way they ensure we don't unite against them. That's a primary tactic of theirs. I did begin the show by saying that I generally try to avoid, which I know you do too, seeing the world through Democratic versus Republican, this prism of the two parties, because there's no way to be led astray more quickly than by succumbing to believing that that's how to understand the world. And in general, as you just said, avoiding these labels like left versus right. If, though, you notice another tactic of mainstream media power centers, corporate journalism, and these politicians as well, they don't want to forget about those labels. These are really important weapons in their hands. I recounted the history that brought you to the show because in part, I think it's hilarious that you were working with Cenk and Anna, the two dumbest Democrats on the planet, but also because it wasn't that long ago when I think you called yourself, or you considered yourself, a progressive, somebody doing your politics on the left. You were a supporter of Bernie Sanders. You believed the Democrats needed to move left. I think you kind of, like a lot of us did, fell for the squad, at least to some extent, at the beginning. When it comes to the question of these labels now, do you claim those labels still? Do you see yourself as working from the left or as a progressive, or have you entirely rejected them in favor of this kind of anti-establishment, pro-establishment framework for understanding things?
Well, like you, I consider myself a white supremacist. Isn't that where we're at now?
Yeah, well, I mean, all you have to do is pick up any newspaper and you see each of us described that way, and a fascist and a far-right extremist. And I guess that's why I'm asking you is, given how, weaponized these labels are, do you just kind of wash your hands of them entirely, or do you still insist on claiming some?
No, I don't. I used to call myself a progressive, but now the people who call themselves progressives are pro-war. They're war pigs, right? So Bernie Sanders, the squad, and all the people who support them uncritically are war pigs. It's unbelievable what has happened. So what I say now I'm politically homeless. And so I don't like those labels. And I will just call myself a populist, I guess, because I think labels certainly now divide. I really did like the idea of being a progressive because the word's nice and it does mean making progress and all that stuff, but they've bastardized that word, and they've, it's not what it means. They don't stand for anything progressive. Bernie Sanders just became, in modern day parlance, he became a cuck to the Democratic Party and Joe Biden, and he'll do whatever they say, and then he'll come out and gaslight his followers about it, just like he gaslights the followers about voting for $100 billion to Ukraine while there's people living under every bridge in America. So no, I don't call myself that anymore. I think I would just call myself a populist.
You did, though, refer to this phrase, you use this phrase, politically homeless, which I understand where that's coming from. At the same time, you have built, as I said, this gigantic community where your shows routinely attract an audience that would produce envy in many shows on the largest corporate branded show networks on the planet, CNN and MSNBC, to say nothing of these newer outlets. We're here for 2 weeks now, barely just 2 weeks. I think we're close to 10,000 people watching live, almost within the first 8 hours of every show that we post. We have 150, 200,000, often more. You have 1 million subscribers. So clearly, there's a lot of other people, if you're politically homeless, who are there with you. What is it that has been the cause of the popularity, not only of your show, but of this entire sector of the media ecosystem, which clearly is growing and thriving at the exact time corporate journalism is collapsing?
People are hungry for the truth. They feel the pain of their life, right? And then so they look to their leadership and they look to the corporate media, and they're being gaslit all the time. And if they're not being gaslit, the corporate media is talking about how bad it is that workers have power in the market now, or that have savings. I just watched a clip on CNBC that said just those two very things, that it's bad for business that workers have power and that they have savings. It's the craziest thing. So the reason why the people, I think, come to my show is because I was an unabashed ultra lefty, right? I'm a peacenik, anti-war, I'm for Medicare for all. I'm all this stuff, anti-Wall Street, and so the people on all sides of the spectrum, people on the right, they see that I'm honest, and they say, because I can honestly critique people who used to be my heroes, like Bernie Sanders, the Democratic Party, the people who are supposed to line up with my political point of view, I critique them the hardest because they're the ones who have been lying to me. And so people on the left appreciate that because they've been lied to, and people on the right appreciate that because they appreciate my honesty. So then when I say something about Trump or Russiagate or whatever it is, they can trust that I'm saying it honestly and that I'm not trying to gaslight them. I'm not bought by anyone. And so I don't know, I travel the country, right, all the time as a stand-up comedian. I meet people of all stripes and all colors, and you go to my show, there's hippies, there's right-wingers, there's libertarians, there's lefties, socialists, communists, there's all kinds of people there. And what they're really desperate for is authenticity, and for someone to speak against the people who are crushing them. And that's what they find at my show. And you can't find that anymore on the left. It's the craziest thing. All the YouTubers just go along now with Joe Biden. They go along with the COVID narrative. There's no.
They run
pushback.
interference for the squad. They whatever it is the squad does. They have this whole media industry who built their brands around their association with Bernie and AOC, and therefore need them to be authentic, even though they're obvious frauds. Otherwise, their whole industry collapses. So let me ask you about that. The sort of like coalition that has emerged that makes independent media successful. And I mean, it's, I call it kind of Roganism, right? Like the most influential media figure in this country, especially among young people, is someone who's, it's impossible to pigeonhole ideologically or even by party, which is Joe Rogan. There's this kind of very similar ecosystem that has arisen, of which we're both clearly a part. And one of the tactics they use against you, and we have very similar tactics used against both of us, so I'm always, I can recognize it very easily, is to say that you started pandering to almost an entirely right-wing audience, in part because that's how you get rich, but in part because that's your politics. And for one thing, I'm always amazed at this idea that in order to get rich, you have to move to the right, when the easiest way to get rich in American politics in the Trump year, the people who sold the books and the Lincoln Project scumbags, was to just talk about how Trump is Hitler and was in bed with Vladimir Putin. That was the easiest path to wealth, was to become liberals. That's why they all did that, not to try and change. But all you have to do is look at your your comment section of your YouTube show or your Rumble show, and the same as mine, and you'll see this incredibly diverse audience. And it reminds me of, facts like there really are millions and millions of people in this country who twice voted for Obama and then voted for Trump. Or who in 2016 were saying, like Joe Rogan did, my two favorite candidates are Trump and Bernie Sanders. Which makes no sense to elite opinion makers, because they only can see the world through Democrat versus Republican. But to millions and millions of Americans, and I think to you, and I'm sure I know for me, that makes all the sense in the world. That people who liked Obama's, I'm going to go to Washington and destroy the way things work, love Trump's, I'm going to go drain the swamp, or the two candidates, Trump and Bernie, who were railing against, corporatism and globalism, ended up finding very similar bases of admiration. How do you define the audience that has coalesced, in terms of your show and in terms of these people who are making independent media so popular?
I think it's hard to define what my audience is. I think my audience is just, again, like I said before, we come together on big things, right? So we're against police brutality, we're against war, and we're for health care. Now, even the latest polls show that 73% of people who consider themselves Republicans think the government should take a role in providing health care for everyone. So these are things that we can all agree on. So I think that's the thing that kind of brings my audience together, is that they want authenticity. They stand up against authoritarianism. They stand up against endless war, imperialism. And the thing about Trump, people forget that Michael Moore in 2016, before the election, gave a speech that made its rounds on the internet about how the people voting for Trump, they're not voting for Trump because they might like Trump. They're voting for Trump because they want to take a brick and throw it through the window of the establishment. And that's what he represented. And they forget the thrill people got when Trump was standing up at those debates, and I think it was in South Carolina, and he turned to Jeb Bush and said, your brother did that war. They lied about the war. They lied about the war. And that's what people were dying and begging for someone to say that on television. So they said it to his face. So that was, and another reason why they hate Trump so much is because he'll accidentally tell a truth that they can't have told, like that there's a deep state, or the fact that when they said, hey, Trump, why are you leaving your troops in Syria? And he said, for the oil. You can't do that. Then the game is over, and they got to get rid of that.
Or when they demanded of him that he denounced Putin on the grounds that Putin kills and imprisons dissidents and journalists, and Trump responded by saying, what, you think we're so innocent? You don't think we kill anybody? Basically the answer that Noam Chomsky would have given, and that was among the angriest he made the establishment. I gave you what I called your reading assignment for tonight. I'm sure, being who you are, you ignored me and didn't read it, but I'll just summarize it for the audience, even in case you did read it, which I found fascinating, which is there's this hardcore leftist leader in Germany who has become one of the most popular politicians in Germany, even though she started with the Communist Party. She still kind of identifies as a Marxist, but she's popular not only among the left, but even parts of the populace right now. And the reason is that her views have become things like questioning why Germany continues to be in NATO, questioning why Germany is risking the welfare of its own citizens by alienating Russia to support this war in Ukraine that Germany has no benefit in one way or the other. She was opposed to COVID mandates. She kind of uses that old left-wing argument about how immigration has become a international corporate plot to drive down wages. And she's finding all kinds of common ground, and you see this ability to unite these, what are supposed to be these two sides that are supposed to hate each other, that are constantly told they should hate each other. Do you see as part of your project an attempt to bridge these gaps, or is that just something that happens organically as a result of your show?
Well, at first it was organic. Well, you know, I have people in my family that voted for Trump, so I can't hate them. You know, what am I supposed to do? Hate them? A lot of people did hate them. So, you know, the crazy thing is that in my mind, Glenn, and you've stayed consistent, I've stayed consistent. It's the liberal class that has moved to the right on big, major issues. And so, for instance, free speech. Now, if you're for free speech, you're considered right wing. I go in comedy clubs in Los Angeles, right, every night, and I'll see comedian almost once a night. Somebody will say something about free speech and how it's now a right wing thing. And I just so they've shifted, and so now that's why they call us. And so it is now part of my mission to bring people together, to not demonize your neighbor. Your neighbor isn't the guy causing your pain. They want you to be distracted and think Trump voters are your enemy. They're not. We share a common enemy. And that enemy right now, so just like what's happening with McCarthy today, right? So whether it's McCarthy, whether it's Nancy Pelosi, you and I both know they work for the same people. I have friends who say to them, who are still Democrats, who say, I wish the Democrats were just better at their jobs. Hey, the Democrats are great at their job. You just don't know what their job is. Their job is to be the Washington Generals to the Harlem Globetrotters. And what people don't remember is that the same guy who pays the Washington Generals is the same guy who pays the Harlem Globetrotters, just like the same guy who pays the Republicans and the Democrats.
Because you need the theater. You need that theater of two sides playing for the same side but appearing to fight one another.
I just saw I think on your Twitter feed, there was a video of Joe Biden saying how great friends he is with Mitch McConnell, right? And that's all you need to know. It's a class war. It's already been waged, and they won.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. When I first started writing, it was not only common but almost obligatory, if you wanted to succeed in left liberal politics, to affirm that George Bush and Dick Cheney were similar to Hitler. And now Michelle Obama and Barack Obama love to make very flamboyant showings of hugging the Bushes and the Cheneys. Liz Cheney has become, despite having never changed a single one of her view, like Bill Kristol and David Frum and all those scumbag neocons who started wars, heroes to the American liberal establishment and to American liberals. I want to talk a little bit about why I regarded today as such a great day to have you on. What I think a lot of people don't realize watching the thing with Kevin McCarthy and his, this desperation to get almost every Republican vote on his side to become a speaker, which gives every Republican member great power because the small majority means they each have leverage. Back in 2020, Nancy Pelosi was in a very similar position. She had very few votes that she could lose, which vested every individual Democrat with a great deal of power because they could withhold their vote to make her speaker in exchange for some kind of concession. And you came up with and pioneered a theory or a strategy that you called force the vote that I think incited one of the bitterest and most hateful infighting episodes within left liberal politics that I've seen in a long time for really revealing reasons. So explain to people what that strategy was for those who don't remember back in 2020. What was the scenario with Pelosi? And why did it lead to such vitriol against you?
Again, just like the McCarthy's in that spot. So when the squad got elected, they called them the squad. And why do you call them the squad? Because they're supposed to act together, right? So if they acted together and voted together, they could actually deny Nancy Pelosi the speakership, right? So that was my idea. Hey, in order for her to get elected as speaker, she needs your votes. You can deny it to her if you vote as a block, as a squad. And so now you can extract something from your vote, just like the right wing of the Republican Party is doing. So that was the idea. It wasn't my idea, Glenn. The idea was in the DSA's handbook from 2 years earlier. And they all ran on doing something like this. AOC ran. She used to complain when she ran for office the first time that we can't even get a vote on Medicare for all on the House floor. We can't even get a vote. So when I decided, well, you now have the power to extract something with your vote for her as speaker, that would be the thing we've all agreed on for a generation, that we need to get a vote for Medicare for all on the House floor. I thought that would be an easy thing that we all agreed on. We all do agree on it. They pretended to not agree, meaning the squad, AOC, all those people pretended that that was a bad strategy. It's not a strategy. It's a thing that you do. It's politics 101. It's what the Republican right wing is doing right now. And so they didn't do it, and what they did was they got their minions in the press, like at TYT, you mentioned those people, Cenk Uygur, Ryan Grimm at The Intercept, and they all ran interference. Or also David Sirota came on my show and said Kevin McCarthy could become speaker if they withhold their vote. So there was a lot of people who are considered lefties who were running interference for politicians. And it got exposed. And so why was it so contentious? Was there so much vitriol? Why did I become so hated? Why did they write all those hit pieces about me in the establishment magazines? Because I exposed the game. So now everybody knows that AOC, the squad, Rashid Tlaib, Jamal Bowman, they're all fakers. And it's what I think Chris Hedges said before me, it's worse to have those people inside the Democratic Party because it gives people the misimpression, the bad idea that there's someone in the Democratic Party or in government actually fighting for you. So it keeps you going into the Democratic Party, just like Shama Sawant said, that the road for progressives leads to a graveyard inside the Democratic Party. And that's what this revealed, because they didn't have to ask permission to do this. They could have did it. But instead of withholding their vote and extracting a concession for the progressive wing of the party, which is what we elected them to do, instead of doing that, they rolled over for the establishment on purpose to protect their own careers. They all got book deals and stuff after that. And that's what they're and then what did they do? They then demonized the activists like us. AOC said that I was committing violence against her with my words. Okay. And so, which led me to say, well, you can stab me with an adjective and I'll hit you with a bat and you can tell me which one is actual violence. Okay. So that's what forced the vote was. We wanted to force a vote for Medicare for all on the House floor. And the leverage we could use was that Nancy Pelosi could not get elected speaker without their votes. They decided not to do it. They turned on the healthcare activist base, and the rest is history. They never, ever voted together as a bloc. Instead, they did one time vote together to make sure a horrible funding bill for Israel went through.
You know, Jimmy, I kind of pride myself on being a good judge of character. I've been around politics and journalism for a long time now, so I feel like I'm not easily fooled. And yet, one of the most shameful episodes was that in 2018, I really did get taken in by AOC. You know, I remember it very vividly. Ryan Graham, who you mentioned, who was the Washington bureau chief of The Intercept, called me and said, hey, there's this candidate in Queens who's challenging, you know, this member of Congress who'd been there for decades. He was a hardcore AIPAC loyalist. All he wanted to do was transfer as much money of the United States taxpayers to Israel as possible, stand behind everything Israel did no matter what, even if it came at the expense of the American government. Obviously, I was not a fan of his. But I also was very wary of these challengers because I've seen so many times where they wave this banner of dissidents and they quickly get co-opted. So I wanted to kind of kick the tires, metaphorically speaking, on AOC. And I asked an interviewer, and she subjected herself to a almost 1 hour interview where I really asked these probing questions. I wanted to see if it was bullshit or if there was actual substance behind it. And go watch it on YouTube and you tell me if you wouldn't have gotten fooled as well. I mean, every question I asked, she had the perfectly constructed answer that seemed so thoughtful and compelling and genuine. Maybe she's just like one of those once-in-a-generation sociopaths like Bill Clinton who just has an immense talent to deceive people. But part of me still really wonders whether there was ever anything authentic about her and people like her, and then they got co-opted by Washington, or whether it was a scam and a fraud all along. Or maybe it doesn't even matter. But what is your view on that?
Once in a lifetime psychopaths, and it's the name of my new special. Anyway, so I think it does. You're right. It doesn't matter. But in retrospect, this was always a game being played by her. You know, she worked for Ted Kennedy, right? Didn't AOC intern for a Kennedy or something like that? And so she always was, in retrospect, she was always maneuvering to do this and be this way. And then I found out that the day she got elected, was the last time she called one of the founders of the Justice Democrats. She stopped even talking to those people. So I think this was in the works all along with someone like her. And I think it is a once in a lifetime psychopath, just like Bill Clinton. She's great at getting people in. And of course, she plays up that she's a victim somehow all the time. She's got 12 million Twitter followers. She never asked them to do anything except to do a phony stunt to get a moratorium on mortgages on this Capitol steps, which was 100% stunt. And it was obvious to see. We called it out immediately. But that's all they're done. All they have is virtue signaling and stunts like that and crying victim. Yeah, I think it is a once in a lifetime, and I fell for it too. So don't beat yourself up too bad. I pride myself on having a pretty good BS detector, but she got me.
Yeah, for sure. I plead guilty to that also. Obviously, I think one of the most important episodes of this year, clearly the most important foreign policy debate of the Biden administration. I would argue probably the most important foreign policy debate of the last 6 years, going back to the Trump era, is the decision by the Biden administration to involve the U.S. very directly in the war in Ukraine, to the point where all the things we swore we wouldn't do at the beginning because it was too provocative, we're now not just doing, but doing it out in the open. You saw when Zelensky visited, Congress couldn't get on their feet enough in a bipartisan way, with the exception of some Republicans who didn't show up. He draped the dais of the American Capitol with the Ukrainian flag, not with the American flag, and no one thought there was anything wrong with that. They thought that was inspiring. And every single last Democrat, Jimmy, including Bernie, who wrote an op-ed in The Guardian right before the war, warning of how dangerous it was for the U.S. to involve itself, and Ilhan Omar, who went and tweeted about how we're going to send money to Ukraine. If we do that, it's going to end up in the hands of neo-Nazi militias, and that's going to be the most dangerous thing we could do. And Cori Bush, who on the day she voted, issued a statement explaining her vote, which was actually a really eloquent reason not to send that money, about how it was all going to go to Raytheon and the CIA. They have no pretense even of core values. I mean, if you're someone who claims to be on the left and is now willing to send tens of billions of dollars, limitless amounts of money to fuel a CIA proxy war, knowing it's going to General Dynamics and Boeing and the CIA at a time when Americans are suffering, how did it become this extreme, where there's no, as I said, even pretense among Democrats to be concerned with any of this anymore, while 7 or 8 dozen Republicans are voting no for all the right reasons?
Well, they saw that there was no consequence for the squad not doing force the vote during when they were electing Nancy Pelosi as Speaker. They 100% turned on their base. They 100% went again with the DSA handbook said that they should do the Democratic Socialists of America, which AOC considers herself. They definitely went against it 100%. The DSA in fact, they attacked me instead of holding their feet to the fire. They're supposed to get kicked out of the DSA for crushing a strike. They crushed a union strike. And there's no consequence anymore. The left has been 100% co-opted. I don't know. Again, I don't know how we get out of this. All I can do is keep telling the truth, and my audience grows because of it. But that's why they're able to do this, Glenn. That's why they're able to spend $100 billion in Ukraine. They could have ended homelessness in the United States 3 or 4 times over, and they just won't do it. And I'm saying now that, hey, I'll let you send $100 billion to Ukraine, because that's how the gears of corruption work in our government. As long as you send $100 billion to Los Angeles, Houston, Chicago, Boston, Minneapolis, San Francisco, and we can use that to help. But they won't do that, right? Because the gears of government now, it's so corrupted. It's 100%. People in America think that their government and their politicians are just regular corrupt, and that some people are good and some people are bad. They don't understand that it's 100% corporate capture. We're now being run by like a mafia, not like a mafia. It is a mafia, and they don't care. And the gears of government only work in the direction of corruption, which is why we can send $100 billion to Ukraine at the blink of an eye, and still won't send $1 million to Flint to fix their water. So this this is where 100, and Americans are the most propagandized people in the world, and they have no idea that they are. At least in Russia and China, they know that stuff was propaganda. In America, they turn on Rachel Maddow. They think they're getting the news. I'm not kidding. So that's why they're allowed to do this, and that's why it happens, that corruption at the blink of an eye. We're at the end of our empire, Glenn. I don't know how much longer we're going to be. There is no middle class. What do you call a system that takes the richest country the face of the earth has ever seen and renders half of its population poor or low income? 80% of workers live paycheck to paycheck, and 50% of wage earners earn 30 grand or less. That's a failed system, and it's not getting any better. It's only getting worse.
Yeah, you know,
people who are running this country. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think if you look at history, it's really interesting when, you know, empires start to collapse, when you start to get such a breach between how the elite lives and how the rest of the country lives. There usually are two options. You can either start to placate and appease the vast majority of the country who are living in deprivation, you know, some symbolic gestures of social programs just enough to keep them mollified so they don't go out into the streets. Or you can decide, you know what? We don't really care how angry the citizenry gets. What we're going to do instead is paramilitarize the country. We'll put them under a massive surveillance system. We'll keep a really close eye on everything they're doing. We'll listen to their communications, and we'll crush first by demonizing and then criminalizing and then censoring any form of dissent so that they have absolutely nowhere to turn, so they can get as angry as they want. But we'll make ourselves so powerful and so opaque, no one will know what we're doing, but we can see everything they're doing, that there's nothing they can do about it anyway. And amazingly, it is the American left who has become the main allies in imposing that. Let me just switch subjects for a little bit to COVID and the issue with the Twitter files, because one of the things that I think impelled the popularity of your show was you were on YouTube on your show, often questioning COVID orthodoxy almost from the beginning, when it was basically taboo to do so, questioning the pronouncements of Fauci and the World Health Organization about vaccines and cloth masks and certainly vaccine mandates. One of the episodes of the Twitter files, and I mean the Twitter files, it's amazing what happened there. Like the corporate media on the first day announced it's all corrupted, it's all trivial, it's all nothing burgers, it's all meaningless, and they've ignored and trained millions of people to ignore every last revelation that has come out about how the FBI is policing the internet, and not one Democratic Party politician other than Ro Khanna has even mentioned it. But let me just show you a couple of the tweets. Put those up about what the episode about COVID and censorship of COVID dissent showed. I'm not sure if it's on the screen, so let me just read it. This is from David Zweig, the reporter who did this. We interviewed him. He wrote, quote, "Inevitably, dissident yet legitimate content was labeled as misinformation, and the accounts of doctors and others were suspended both for tweeting opinions and with demonstrably true information." And then he gave a couple of examples showing that it wasn't just random uncredentialed trolls, as they're called, meaning citizens, who were being censored because of their dissent, but actual very credentialed members of the medical establishment, people who are doctors and scientists who were questioning a lot of these lies from the beginning. And this was being done at the behest of Homeland Security and the FBI, who were saying, we need you to take this down because this is misinformation, which should be disturbing even if it weren't misinformation, but so much of it turned out to be true. As someone who was covering that in real time, warning of how COVID dissidence was being demonized and then banned, how do you look at these Twitter files, and what do you think about the fact that literally not one Democrat beyond Ro Khanna, whose name was involved in the beginning, has even mentioned these, let alone done anything about them?
Well, it's depressing, but I guess it's to be expected that they're not going to do anything about it, because they're the ones who want to do the censoring. They are the establishment now. The Democratic Party is no different. It's a broken record, but they are no different than the Republican Party. So they're the ones who want to do the censoring, right? So they're in control, and they're so okay with that. And so as soon as COVID happened, when I got vaccine injured, I started to look into the COVID narrative. I didn't really look into it before that. And at every turn, they were lying. And so I got
Explain what happened to you. Explain what happened to you in that story briefly. I don't want to force you to delve into the personal drama, but you've talked about it, and it was an important part of what happened in your navigating this COVID debate. So explain what happened for people who don't know.
So I got the Moderna vaccine. I got the first one. I had my side effects for a week. Okay. Then I thought they went away. And then whatever it was 3 or 4 weeks later, I got my second one. And I got sick, and I never got better. I had horrible headaches and body aches and joint pain, and I had like horrible flu-like symptoms, as if I had COVID. And so I tweeted about it after 5 weeks after my second jab. I tweeted about it to see if there was anyone else having these symptoms. And of course, there were lots of people having lots of crazy symptoms. And I got a doctor who was running a study trying to figure out how to treat long COVID. He's entered me in that study because his theory was that people who got vaccine injured in the way I did would be presenting biologically as people who had long COVID. And they did some sophisticated blood tests, and he showed me that as if I had COVID, though I never did, and I got it from the vax. And so that's what was causing all these problems. And one of the drugs, they gave me a bunch of drugs, right? Azithromycin, all kinds of stuff. One of them was ivermectin. And I go, hey, that's not horse shit. I don't want to take that. And he just looked at me and he said, Jimmy, that's not what it is. It was considered a wonder drug before COVID. They thought it could cure cancer. It saved billions of lives. It's more safe than aspirin. You're being lied to about it. And when he told me that, it was like that's such a huge lie that I was just like, wow, I bet this whole thing could possibly be a lie. And it turns out it was. They lied about masks. They lied about herd immunity. They lied about natural immunity. They lied about the transmission, the vaccine stopping transmission. They lied about everything at every turn. And they didn't even study if it stopped transmission. So how can you mandate something on that? So anyway, that's where it started for me. And then so once I started to challenge the COVID narrative, I was like, oh my God, they're lying at every turn. And then people started calling me anti-vax. And I had to go, no, I got the vax. I got injured by the vax. And I'm just telling you, these guys are pathological liars. And Fauci was obviously a pathological liar and a criminal. And so was Collins at the NIH. And so is Walensky, is that her name, at the CDC. They all lied and said that the vaccine stops the transmission of the virus when because of a European Parliament politician had to ask a question of a Pfizer executive did you test to see if it stopped transmission? They said they didn't even test to see if and my question is, so when they by the way, Pfizer didn't want to release their vaccine trial data for 75 years. Do you remember that? And I was like, I didn't know Pfizer killed Kennedy. So anyway, it was when a judge ordered them to release their vaccine trial data, which that gives you trust in science, doesn't it? When a judge has to order the company to release their vaccine trial data, that feels safe and secure. Well, they did finally release it, but nobody went. Where are the scientists who were supposed to look through there and find out that, hey, they didn't test for transmission? I had to wait for a politician in Europe to ask a Pfizer executive that question. Why weren't there articles being written all over the place about how they didn't do this and how they can't justify mandates? I'm a comedian. I'm not a goddamn scientist or a doctor. That's their job. They should have did that. But now it's my job to report the shit they didn't investigate.
You know, one of the things, on this whole COVID issue, the thing that strikes me so much is not the fact that the health establishment got things wrong on some level. Even if operating in the best of faith, you would expect them in a new complex pandemic to get things wrong. What was amazing about it was they foreclosed any questioning or any debate on purpose about what they were saying because they knew how dubious it was and didn't want anyone challenging it. I think the most shameful example is the very first one, the kind of thing that kicked it off, when Peter Danzig and those other scientists wrote that letter in the Lancet, in Lancet, declaring the debate closed on the question of whether or not the virus was zoonotic or whether or not it leaked from the lab in Wuhan. And without disclosing the extremely significant conflict that Peter Danzig and his company had been involved in partnership and funding with gain-of-function research in that very Wuhan lab, they lied clearly by saying they had conclusive evidence that it was zoonotic, only for the Biden administration to a year later say even they don't know what the answer was and open an investigation, and only then did it become permissible on big tech to debate this because now the government said it's okay to debate it, so now you're allowed to debate it now that the government has given permission. You come from this line, this world of comedy, which, even though you sometimes use to kind of minimize what you're doing, like comedians have always been political, and one of the main values they've stood for, from like Lenny Bruce and George Carlin, is the evils of censorship and the need to say what you want. This was always a value directly associated with the American left. I grew up with the ACLU defending Skokie, and they became my childhood heroes. So when you combine free speech, which really did used to be a value of the left, along with a fundamental mistrust, really healthy and valid, of the CIA and the NSA and the FBI, You still see this on the international left, and that's part of why I always show Jeremy Corbyn opposed vaccine mandates and vaccine passports, something that would be completely taboo here. Lula da Silva in Brazil constantly crusades for Julian Assange and says it's at least as much Zelensky's fault what's happening in the war, not Putin's, something you would never drag out of a Democratic Party politician's mouth here. What has happened uniquely to the American left that was once their core defining values on at least some of these issues, free speech, questioning authority, distrusting and disliking the deep state, have completely evaporated, and now these are values that you almost exclusively, with very rare exception, on a few isolated and pretty kind of obscure left-wing sites, you find almost exclusively from right-wing populists in the Republican Party or the conservative movement. What happened there?
I've never seen anything like this in my life. I never thought I would see anything like this, right? Everybody talks about challenging authority, and it's either, when it came to COVID, either you did what the man on the TV, either what you did what Fauci said without question, and then that made you a good person. It became a good person versus bad person thing. It was really weird. And if you question it, you're a bad person, and you're a Trumper, and you're a white supremacist. I'm like, no, I didn't vote for Trump. I just have questions about an experimental medical treatment that everyone's being mandated to take. And then they would say, Jimmy, only dumb people ask questions. You know that. I mean, it was the craziest. And I've seen comedians in Los Angeles go on stage and tell the crowds, please tell me you're not going to do your own research. You know, before COVID, doing your own research just meant reading. So now Big Pharma has got even left-wing comedians to ingest their propaganda and spit it out to shame people for reading. Like, I woke up in the middle of a Bill Hicks bit. Well, looks like we got ourselves a Rita. What you reading for? So you wouldn't tell people that about anything else. No matter how trivial, you wouldn't tell them not to get informed about it. Hey, I'm going to go buy a car. Don't look into it. Well, how will I know what car to buy? Ask the salesman. He's the expert. This is the mentality that the left has gotten, this deference to authority. And they say things like, trust the science, have faith in the science. You don't have faith in science. You have faith in religion. You don't. Science is empirical data. You know, the reason why we know about the speed of light and black holes and all that stuff, and we have a different idea about gravity, is because Einstein challenged the science. You question the science. You don't have faith in it. You don't trust science. You question it. Lies don't like to be questioned. Truth doesn't mind being challenged. And so why has that happened on the left? I think there's a lot of reasons. Lefties are just fucking weak. And Trump scared the shit out of them, and they let it happen. So they didn't want to be called in bed red-brown alliance. They didn't want to be seen as somehow favoring Trump. So whatever Trump said, they just do the opposite. And everything Trump bad, Orange Man bad, and they believe they're fighting fascism by fighting Trump. You're not. You're fighting a game show host who got to be president because your two-party duopoly is so goddamn corrupt. People are willing to take a chance on a fucking game show host who's wearing a raccoon for a haircut instead of voting for known criminals in both parties.
Yeah, the fascists probably are the people wanting to unite corporate and state power to censor the internet, or who suddenly revere the CIA. That's probably where the institutions of fascism lie. Well, Jimmy, we're at the end of our show. We're actually a disciplined professional show that has a beginning and a scheduled end. But I'm so happy you came on, and for all those endless, torturous hours that you made me stay on your show over all these years. We're going to be constantly chasing you and forcing you to come back and talk to us all the time. So this is only the beginning of your appearance here and not even close to the end. So thank you really for taking the time out. I really enjoyed talking to you.
I appreciate it, Glenn. Thanks for having me on. It's good to see you dressed up because, you know, usually you look like a slob when you come on my show. So it's nice to see you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I dress appropriately for whatever venue I'm in, and I dress appropriately for your show and my show. Like I said, is professional, and I dress appropriately for that. Have a great evening, Jimmy. Thanks again. I'll see you soon. All right, well, that concludes our show for this evening. We're really thrilled to have spent so much time being able to talk to Jimmy. Like I said, we're going to have him back on soon. As always, when we're done with our show here, we move to locals for the live after show where we take your questions, respond to your feedback. For those of you who are part of that community, we're really appreciative. For those of you who want to join, it's just click on the right upper hand button on the page that says join, and you can become part of locals, have full access to our after show as well. And for those of you who have been watching, we're really appreciative. We hope to see you back here tomorrow night and every night, 7 o'clock p.m. Eastern, live only here on Rumble. Have a great night.